I think we all understand the need for water, Witherspoon said, in a tone so condescending it immediately reminded Malloy of the fur ranch supervisor he'd worked for in Kansas. If you understood it, you'd turn off that damn fountain, Malloy fired back. Mr. Malloy, the people here are trying to build homes. We want to build a community. We moved here to get away from the city, the crime. We want our community to be safe and attractive, and that lake is a big part of that. That is an excerpt from the book The Big Empty by author Loren Steffy. In this special podcast series, we're going to focus on current and economic and cultural issues faced by the state of Texas, its governments, and its citizens. We're going to explore these issues through the lens of Loren Steffy's book. The Big Empty is set in 1999 and is a tale about the sense of place and tells the story of a fictional company, AzTech, which moves or builds a semiconductor plant in the dying West Texas city of Conquistador. This attempt is beset by the clash of culture and bringing in Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs to rural Texas. The book also raises multiple economic issues facing Texas as we move towards the mid-21st century. Over this 5-part podcast series, we will consider the following issues facing Texas today: water, power, land investment, housing, and of course, the clash of cultures. I know you'll enjoy this podcast series featuring the book's author, Loren Steffy, as we look at these issues through the lens of his book, The Big Empty. In episode 1, we take up the issue of water. Hello everyone, Tom Fox back again with a special 5-part series on economic and cultural issues from The Big Empty with the book's author, Loren Steffy. Loren, I'm thrilled to start this podcast series with you. I've been wanting to do it for a while. As much as I enjoyed The Big Empty, it struck me that you have touched upon many of the current economic and cultural issues facing Texas circa 2022. So I wanted to see if maybe we could use what you wrote in the book as a setup to explore each one of those. So that, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. This is great. I'm really excited to be talking about this.
Could you maybe start off with telling our listeners a little bit about what you had envisioned with The Big Empty? Is it the book you had envisioned starting with? Obviously, it changed as you wrote it and people read it and commented, but what story were you trying to tell?
I was really fascinated by this idea of the sense of place and what happens when that sense of place starts to change. If human history is basically change over time, then every place that we know changes in some way, and some change more than others. And that was really what I was trying to get at. This was a small rural community that was facing extinction, really. And they were trying to come up with a way to preserve their future, which they thought they had done. But then the question becomes, what's the price of that future? And do you have to give up everything that you know, your way of life? And caught up in that is this idea that people live a certain way in certain places based on the environment that they know better than anybody else. And so when outsiders come in, it may seem, oh, this is stupid. Why are you doing that? But in fact, there's a good reason for it. And so if you show up in West Texas and think that you should have a golf course and a decorative fountain in your neighborhood, somebody may tell you that's not how we use water in West Texas.
And you took that sense of place literally back to, I think, the 1840s. And with the original settlers from the geographic area that encompassed the Big Empty and brought the issues that they faced in the 19th century forward to the 20th century and then forward into the 21st century. And one of the things that struck me was many of the issues from the 1840s, the 1870s are still facing those parts of Texas today.
Yeah, it's really true. The past informs the future, right? And not only is it true from what happened in the 1840s, 1800s forward, but the book itself is set at 1999, at the cusp of the new millennium. And at the time I wrote this, I thought one of the things I might get called out for is the idea that we're going to build a chip plant in a small town. Well, is that really going to happen? And then you look at what's going on now, and a lot of these themes have actually become more prominent since I started writing the book, or since I got the idea for the book. It's really been interesting to me to watch some of the, part of the whole reason we're doing this podcast is because these issues are still very current today.
So let's start with the issue of water, and that's going to take up this episode. And you mentioned the golf course, but I wanted to mention the lake. And first, so I'm going to ask you if you could tell us about the lake. The lake ends up playing a very big part in the resolution of this story as well. So in many ways, the lake becomes a hero near the end of the book. I won't give that away, but could you tell us what the lake meant to the newcomers, and equally importantly, what the lake meant to the townsfolk?
Yeah, and I think even the term lake is somewhat it would be in dispute, right, depending on what your sense of a lake is. This was really more of a pond or perhaps even a water feature, right? But basically, when the workers from the chip plant begin to move into the town of Conquistador, they want to build a neighborhood. They want to build a gated community, and it has to have a decorative fountain and whatnot in the front. And to them, that's why wouldn't you do that? And of course, as we've seen all over the hill country, developers are like, oh yeah, great. What's the problem? We'll just do it. The locals were very concerned about water use. And keep in mind that semiconductor manufacturing requires a lot of water too. And so an underlying theme of the book is the scarcity of water and the drain on resources that these kinds of developments take.
I can't think of a worse insult to say than your neighborhood has a water feature. Wow. That may be the ultimate Texas insult. Not a lake, not even a pond, but a water feature. I'll have to remember that one. So let's maybe use that to explore some of the issues around water in Texas. You obviously touched on the most important one right now is, do we have enough water? But there's a lot of other issues involved here, such as transportation of water. Heaven forbid when we have too much water again, because we've had that issue before. Yeah. Water treatment, desalinization, and pipelines. Where do you see some of the big issues right now around water, aquifers, and et cetera in Texas?
I think there's obviously here in the hill country, it's a huge issue. The issue of development you're seeing in all the areas west of Austin, for example, they're going in, they're building high density housing developments in places like Dripping Springs without a whole lot of regard for where the water is going to come from for these neighborhoods, not just in the first year or two, but 10, 20 years down the road, right? The developers will be long gone by then. They don't care. But there's a sustainability issue in terms of, are we going to have enough water for drinking and things like that? And you have seen some communities, Dripping Springs, for example, recently put a moratorium on new development. I think they actually just lifted it, but they were studying the water use issue. A lot of other communities are buying water from elsewhere and shipping it in, and that raises all kinds of problems because it's getting pumped from somewhere, and usually from a ranch or something. Our water laws in Texas are unique in the United States. They're based on something called rule of capture, which actually is drawn from England back in like the 1600s or something. And it basically says if you own the land, you can pump out as much water as you want from under that land and do whatever you want with it. And part of the reason we have that law is because, of course, if you're irrigating cotton fields or other farmland, that's a good thing to have. But if you're living in a water-sensitive area and you suddenly have hundreds and hundreds of houses being built all over the place, it's not necessarily a good thing. And there's a lot of conflict coming over water, and we see the same thing playing out in Corpus Christi right now. They're having issues. They had a water plan that involved building desalinization plants. They have invited a lot of heavy industry in that uses a lot of water. The desalinization plants haven't been built, so they're in a crisis. And what happens in these situations, by the way, is the individuals are the ones that wind up bearing the restrictions. And Corpus Christi was a great example. There were restrictions on who could water their lawn, but you've got an industrial plant that's sucking up millions of gallons of water. We've seen that here in the hill country. There are communities, there are cities that are watering their municipal golf courses at the same time and aren't allowed to water their lawns. And what tends to happen is the residents are the ones that have to deal with the restrictions. They're the ones that bear the burden, and in most cases, they do what they need to do. But you're almost getting punished for it because somebody else is going to come in and build more water. I live in Wimberley, and we have a situation here where they just approved a big RV park kind of thing, which of course has to have a swimming pool. And they requested and received permission for 4.5 million gallons of water a year, so that people who don't even live here can swim in a pool in an area that really shouldn't be having swimming pools. And it's the rest of us, we're all trying to use as little water as possible, putting in rainwater collection systems and things like that. But those guys show up, and on a whim, they get granted this permit. So there's a lot of injustice around the issue of water. And while that wasn't necessarily the theme I was trying to hit in the book, I think it does touch on that, this idea that water is a shared resource, and if we don't figure out a smart way to use it better, we're going to have big problems.
Let's touch on the flip side, which I mentioned, of too much water. We both lived in Houston, which has had massive development. We're going to talk about housing in another episode. But what about all those houses built on the Katy Flatlands? West of Houston, it was low land that was rice farms for time immemorial that was designed to have a lot of water in it. Now it's cemented over, streets, houses, etc. What about too much water and flood control? Is there any sort of coordination from that, or do residents of West Harris County or counties west of Houston just build, Katy bar the consequences?
Well, I think we saw the answer to that after Harvey, right? If you lived down below the Addicks Reservoir, you got the answer to that, right? Your neighborhood had to be flooded because developers were allowed to go in and build in an area that they knew if there was a problem, they were going to have to release water from that reservoir, and those areas were designed to be flooded. When we first moved to Houston, and we moved from Dallas, where you don't have the same kind of water issues, and I remember somebody told us, you have to make sure your house isn't in a floodplain. And so when we would look at houses, we would always ask, is this in a floodplain? And I remember one builder telling us, I said, is this in a floodplain? And they said, not really. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And, what they do is they go in, they build retention ponds, and they do all these things that are designed to pull that land off on the flood maps. It gets it out of the floodplain. But if they don't do it right, then you have problems later. And in a lot of cases, it could be years before you know if they did it right or not. And I think Harvey was a pretty good test, right? But this is going to continue to be an issue because the need for development, the need for housing, and certainly in a city like Houston, finding a place that's close in, that's affordable, and doesn't flood is gotten increasingly difficult. And so there's a lot of pressure on development just from a conceptual standpoint, right? People want to live closer to where they work, and at the same time you have all these flooding issues. And so you have to, if you're a homeowner or a home buyer, you have to juggle this, right? Do I want to buy this house? Will it probably be okay? Can we put it up on stilts or whatever? These are the kind of things you have to go through, and it makes it really tough.
I lived in one of those neighborhoods that I flooded out after Harvey. Yeah. But let me go to the end where I won't say water becomes a protagonist, but water plays a very big part in how the story resolves itself. Did that just occur to you? Did you have that in mind? Because I thought it was a great way to tie in this theme of water in the book and water that we were exploring in this podcast, where it goes from really a very scarce resource to something that water has been used for since time immemorial, which is to put out
We talked about this in an earlier podcast about the book. And one of the challenges of writing fiction, you do have to actually kind of plan where the story's going to go. And so, yeah, I did actually think that through, again, because of this theme of water. But I think it really forces the idea that ultimately that water was the saving grace in a dire situation. And that was the point I was trying to hammer home, that's exactly what Trace Malloy, the main character in the book, was trying to get the plant manager, Blaine Witherspoon, to understand from the very beginning. His whole warning was, you don't understand what could happen.
Loren, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode where we take up the issue that we both enjoy, power in Texas. Before we leave, if anyone wanted to get a copy of The Big Easy, The Big Empty, where can they go, Loren?
Pretty much anywhere. It's available on Amazon, all your other online retailers, Barnes & Noble. It should be available in your favorite bookstores, and if it's not, you can ask them for it because they can get it quite easily. You can also go to my publisher's website, stonycreekpublishing.com, and that will direct you to multiple options.
Through a happenstance of events of me losing my copy of your book in Portland, Oregon, it was in the Portland, Oregon bookstores. So it is everywhere. Loren, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks a lot, Tom.
All right. Hope you'll join Loren and I for our next episode where we take up the issue of power in the context of Loren's book, The Big Empty.